The mud on her boots was still wet when they told her the carriage would not wait. Meredith Colborne stood in the entrance hall of Hartley Park, the house she had grown up in, the house her father had built before she was born, the house that no longer belonged to her, and she held a single traveling bag and said nothing. The bag was not hers either. It had belonged to the upstairs maid, a woman named Tess, who had left 2 winters ago without taking it. Meredith's cousin Sylvester had told her she could have it. He had made that sound like generosity. The solicitor, a small man named Mr. Fitch, stood near the door and did not look at her directly. "The arrangement has been made," he said. "You understand the terms." She understood them. She had read them 3 times the night before, sitting on the floor of what had once been her bedroom, the fire reduced to almost nothing because no one had come to tend it. The terms were simple. Her father had died without a will, or so Sylvester claimed, and so the court had found, after the kind of proceedings that favored men with solicitors who ate supper with judges. The estate had passed to the nearest male relation. That was Sylvester. Meredith received nothing. She was 23 years old, and she had nothing. What she had, as of that morning, was a letter of introduction and a position as a lady's companion at Ashfield, the estate of the Duke of Stowe, somewhere in the north of Lincolnshire. Sylvester had arranged that too. She did not think he had done it out of kindness. He had done it because he wanted her gone before she could speak to anyone who might listen. She did not say any of this to Mr. Fitch. She picked up the bag and walked out to the carriage, and when the driver helped her up the step, she thanked him by name, because she had known him since she was 9 years old, and she was not going to pretend otherwise. Even now, the house grew smaller behind her as the carriage moved down the lane, and she turned her face forward and did not look back. The companion position had come with a letter, written in a formal hand on heavy cream paper, signed by the estate's housekeeper, a Mrs. Osgood. The letter described the requirements of the role: assistance to the Duke's elderly aunt, Lady Maud, in her daily correspondence and reading, attendance at meals when required, discretion in all matters. The letter did not mention the Duke himself. It did not describe Ashfield. It was brief and correct and told her almost nothing. What it did not say, what Sylvester had not told her and what she had not known to ask, was that Meredith's mother had once lived at Ashfield, not as a servant, not as a companion, as a daughter. Meredith did not know this yet. She was still 3 hours from the estate when she opened her bag and found, folded between the spare stockings, a small oval portrait wrapped in cloth. Her own hands had packed the bag. She had not put the portrait there. She sat with it on her lap for a long moment, the carriage jolting beneath her, and then she unwrapped it. A woman, young, dark-haired, painted in the style of 30 years ago. A name scratched into the back of the frame in a hand Meredith did not recognize: Eliza Colborne, née Ashfield, 1809. She read the name twice. Then she wrapped the portrait back in the cloth and held it in both hands for the rest of the journey, and she did not sleep. Ashfield was larger than she had imagined. It rose at the end of a long approach through bare November trees, gray stone and tall windows. A house that had been built by people who intended to remain. The drive was well kept. The grounds, even in late autumn, showed signs of careful tending. This was not a house in decline. Whatever else could be said about the Duke of Stowe, he ran his estate properly. Mrs. Osgood met her at the servants' entrance, which was where companions were brought in. She was a tall woman, perhaps 60, with a long face and careful eyes, and a way of taking stock of a person without appearing to do so. "Miss Colborne," she said, "you made good time. The roads were clear." Mrs. Osgood looked at the traveling bag. She looked at Meredith's coat, which was good wool but old, let out at the seams once already. She looked at Meredith's face. "Come inside," she said. "You'll want tea before I show you to your room." The kitchen was warm and smelled of bread. A cook Meredith would later know as Mrs. Brandt moved efficiently around the range without speaking. A young housemaid brought the tea and set it down and left. Mrs. Osgood sat across from Meredith at the long wooden table and poured for them both. Lady Maud is in reasonable health, she said, but she tires easily. She prefers reading in the mornings and correspondence in the afternoons. She does not like to be read to too quickly. She has strong opinions about pace. I'll take note of that. She will test you, Mrs. Osgood said. She tests everyone. She does not mean to be unkind. It is simply that she has strong opinions about everything, and she does not believe in keeping them to herself. I can manage strong opinions, Meredith said. Something shifted in Mrs. Osgood's face. Not quite a smile. I expect you can, she said. She showed Meredith to her room, small, clean, with a window that faced the garden, and told her supper was at 7, and that she would meet Lady Maud the following morning. She paused at the door. The Duke is in residence, she said. He returns from London last week. He is not unkind, but he keeps to himself. The staff does not trouble him unless necessary, and he does not trouble the staff. You will likely see very little of him. Meredith thanked her. Mrs. Osgood left. She set the traveling bag on the bed and took out the portrait and set it on the small table by the window and looked at it in the gray afternoon light. Eliza Colburn, née Ashfield. Her mother's name had been Elizabeth. Everyone had called her Eliza. She had died when Meredith was 4 years old, and Meredith remembered almost nothing of her. A voice, a smell, a sense of warmth. And her father had never spoken of her in any detail that would have been useful. He had loved her. That much was clear. He had loved her, and after she died he had folded that part of himself away, and Meredith had grown up with the shape of an absence she could not name. Née Ashfield. She put her hand flat on the bed and sat down and thought about what that meant. It meant her mother had been born here. It meant her mother had grown up in this house. It meant that somewhere in this estate there were people who had known her mother, perhaps rooms her mother had walked through, perhaps records of a family Meredith had never been told about. It meant that when Sylvester had arranged this position, he had known exactly where he was sending her, and he had said nothing. The fire in the small grate was already lit. Someone on the staff had done that before she arrived. She was grateful for that, in the way you become grateful for small things when larger things have been taken from you. She did not go downstairs for supper. She was not hungry. She sat by the window until the light failed entirely, and then she went to bed, and she held the portrait against her chest, and she slept. Lady Maud was 81 years old and as comfortable in her opinions as a woman who has had 8 decades to refine them. "Sit there," she said, pointing to a chair by the window, when Meredith was brought in the next morning. "No, not that one. The one with the straight back. You'll learn to want it. These soft chairs ruin your posture by 40. Meredith sat in the straight-back chair. Lady Maud examined her without any pretense of subtlety. "Your name is Colburn," Lady Maud said. "Yet, my lady, where are your people from?" There was a pause that Meredith covered smoothly. "Derbyshire originally, my father's family." Lady Maud's eyes narrowed slightly. "And your mother's family?" "My mother died when I was young. I didn't know her family well." This was not a lie. It was the most accurate thing she had said in days. Lady Maud made a sound that might have been acknowledgement. "I had a companion last year named Miss Tilbury," she said. "She cried at everything, every piece of correspondence, every chapter of every book. I cannot be doing with crying. It is undignified and it interrupts the story." "I don't cry easily," Meredith said. "Good." Lady Maud picked up a book from the table beside her and held it out. "We'll start with this. Chapter 4. We've already done the first 3. It was, Meredith noticed, a novel published in 1820. She had read it. "Would you like me to give you a brief account of the first 3 chapters before I begin?" she asked. Lady Maud looked at her with something approaching approval. "Yes," she said, "I would." She had been at Ashfield for a week before she saw the Duke. She had been aware of him in the way you become aware of a presence in a house. A door closing at the far end of a corridor, a fire in the study at unusual hours, Mrs. Osgood's manner subtly shifting when she spoke of certain rooms. But she had not seen him, and she had not sought him out, and she had told herself this was because companions did not seek out the masters of houses, which was true enough. The library was where she found him. Or rather, where he found her. She had gone there on a Tuesday morning, early, before Lady Maud was awake, because she had remembered in the night that a house like this would have records, estate records, parish records, letters, the accumulated paper of a family across generations. She did not know exactly what she was looking for. She knew her mother's family name now. She knew her mother had been born here or had some connection to the house. She wanted to know more than that. The library ran the full length of the East Wing's ground floor. It was a proper library, the kind built for use rather than display. Books on every wall, a long reading table, smaller tables near the windows with chairs that had been positioned to catch the morning light. Meredith had counted the shelves the first time Mrs. Osgood had showed her through the public rooms of the house, and she had noted, without mentioning, that one section of shelves held not books but ledgers. Estate records, household accounts, the sort of thing a family kept for 100 years or more. She was standing at those shelves, pulling out the third ledger to check the date on its spine, when she heard the door. She turned around. The man in the doorway was perhaps 35. He was taller than she had expected, which was irrational since she had not known what to expect. And he wore no coat, only waistcoat and shirt sleeves, which meant he had not anticipated finding anyone in the library at 7:30 in the morning, any more than she had anticipated being found. He had dark eyes and a composed face, the kind of face that had learned, somewhere along the way, to give very little away. He looked at her. He looked at the ledger in her hand. He said, "What are you looking for? Not who are you, not what are you doing. Specifically, what are you looking for?" "I beg your pardon," she said. "I didn't think anyone would be in here at this hour. I'll come back later." "That isn't what I asked," he said. He came into the room. He moved like someone accustomed to being in this particular library, which made sense, because it was his. He stopped at the reading table and looked at the ledger she was holding and then at her. "You're the companion, Miss Colborne?" "Yes." "What are you looking for?" There were several possible answers. She chose the one that was true enough to be defensible. "The estate records. I was curious about the history of the house." He said nothing. He did not appear to disbelieve her exactly. He appeared to be deciding something. "The records from the last 40 years are in the second cabinet from the left," he said. "If you're interested in the earlier period, the documents are in a trunk in the portrait room. Mrs. Osgood has the key." She put the ledger back carefully, exactly where she had found it. "Thank you," she said. "The portrait room," he said, "also has a painting of a woman named Eleanor Ashfield. She was my grandmother's younger sister. I don't know what became of her." He paused. "She left the house when she was 19. I've never been told the full story." Meredith went very still. Eleanor Ashfield, not Eliza, Eleanor, but Eliza was a shortening of Elizabeth, and Elizabeth was a common enough name, and Eleanor and Elizabeth were different. And yet she thought of the portrait in her room, and the name scratched into the back, and something turned over slowly in her chest. "I see," she said, which was not really a response to what he had said. He looked at her for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Then he said, "My name is Grantham, the Duke of Stowe if you prefer formality." A very slight pause. "I don't particularly Meredith Colborne," she said. He nodded, once. He picked up a book from the reading table. She had the impression he had come in for it, and walked out of the library. She stood there for a moment in the silence. Then she went to find Mrs. Osgood and asked about the key to the portrait room. The portrait was large, painted in oils, and hung at the end of a small room furnished with 2 chairs and a fireplace that smelled of old ash. The woman in it was perhaps 18 or 19, dark-haired, with a direct gaze and a dress in a style that Meredith placed at roughly 1805 or 1806. The plaque on the frame read, Eleanor Ashfield. She was looking at her own face. Not exactly. The bone structure was slightly different, the chin, the set of the mouth, but enough. Enough that when Meredith lifted her hand and touched her own jaw, it was because she had just seen the same angle in painted oil and could not quite account for it. Enough that she understood, without question, what she was looking at. Eleanor Ashfield, not Eliza, not her mother, her grandmother. Her mother had been Eliza Colborne, née Ashfield. Her mother had been an Ashfield. Her grandmother had been born in this house, had grown up in this house, had sat for this portrait in this house, and had then left at 19 and apparently never come back, and had married someone named Colborne and had died, and her daughter had married Meredith's father, and Meredith had grown up 30 miles away with no knowledge of any of it. She sat down in one of the chairs and looked at her grandmother's face for a long time. Behind her the door opened. She knew, without turning around, that it was not Mrs. Osgood. Mrs. Osgood's footstep was heavier, more deliberate. This was a quieter step. "You found her," the Duke of Stowe said. She turned around. He was standing in the doorway, his coat on now, as if he had gone and gotten dressed properly for the den come back. He was looking at the portrait, not at her. "I found her," Meredith said. He looked at her then, the same assessing look as the library, except that now there was something else in it, something that was working something out. "The resemblance," he said, carefully, "is noticeable. Yes, Eleanor Ashfield left this house in 1807, he said. She was 19. There was a disagreement, is what the family called it. I've never been told the details. She does not appear in the estate records after that year. I found a reference to her once, in a letter from my great-grandmother to my grandfather, and when I asked about her, I was told it was not a subject for discussion." Meredith said nothing. "Your name is Colborne," he said. "Yes, your mother's family," he said slowly. "You said you didn't know them well." "I didn't," she said. "I'm beginning to." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind moved through the November trees, and somewhere in the house a clock struck 9. "Mrs. Osgood has a trunk," he said, "in the room next to the portrait room. Family correspondence. It hasn't been opened in 30 years, probably more. I'll ask her to bring it in if you'd like." He said it simply, as if it were an ordinary offer, as if she were not sitting in a chair in his portrait room, having just recognized her own face on the wall, as if this were a question of minor household logistics. "Why would you do that?" she asked. He looked at the portrait again for a moment. "Because that woman left this house and disappeared, and no one has ever had an answer for why, and it has been a strange absence in the family for as long as I can remember." He looked back at Meredith. "And because you clearly already know more than you're saying, and I find I'd rather know the story than not." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Have Mrs. Osgood bring the trunk." The trunk contained letters, dozens of them, tied in bundles, some so old the paper had gone brittle at the edges. The handwriting varied. Formal copperplate in some, smaller and more hurried in others. Meredith and the Duke sat on opposite sides of the reading table in the library and went through them in the afternoon light, and Mrs. Osgood brought tea and left without being asked to, which said something about Mrs. Osgood's understanding of significant moments. The story, as it assembled itself from the letters over 2 hours, was not complicated. It was the kind of story that was not complicated in retrospect, and had probably not seemed complicated to the people who made the decisions in it. Eleanor Ashfield had, at 18, wished to marry a man named Robert Colborne. Robert Colborne was a solicitor's son, respectable, educated, without money or title. Eleanor's father had refused. Eleanor had argued. Her father had held firm, as fathers in such stories do, and then he had arranged for her to be sent to relations in Bath, while a more suitable match was identified. Eleanor had gone to Bath. She had stayed with the relations. She had waited, as she was presumably expected to, and then in the spring of 1807 she had married Robert Colborne anyway, quietly, in a parish church, with 2 of his friends as witnesses and no family present. Her father had not spoken to her again. There were several letters from Eleanor to her sister. Not her father, her sister, because the sister had kept them, and they had ended up in the trunk. Letters describing her life. A house in Derbyshire. A daughter born in 1808, named Elizabeth. Another daughter in 1812 who had not lived. Robert's practice doing well enough. The letters growing less frequent in the later years, and then stopping entirely around 1825, which was, Meredith calculated, around the time her mother, Eleanor, Elizabeth, had married her father. My grandmother, Meredith said. She had not meant to say it aloud. The Duke looked up from the letter he was reading. Your grandmother, he said. She left because your family wouldn't accept the man she wanted to marry. She married him anyway. Her father cut her off. Meredith set down the letter she was holding. My mother was born here. Not here, she was born in Derbyshire, but she came from here. Her mother came from here, and no one told me. Who would have told you? My father might have. She thought of him. A quiet man, private, who had kept his grief about her mother, locked in a room she had never been given a key to. I don't know if he knew. He might not have. My grandmother might have never told him, or my mother might have never told him. It was a rupture. Families have them, and then they close over, and after a generation or two the children don't know there's anything missing. The Duke was quiet for a moment. He had set down his own letters and was looking at the table. When I was 14, he said, my grandfather died. He left instructions that Eleanor Ashfield's name was not to be spoken in this house again. My father ignored the instruction, to his credit, but he also didn't know enough to say anything useful. So Eleanor became a portrait on a wall, a gap in the record, the relative no one discussed. He looked up. How did you come to be here? He asked. Not the position. I mean, how did it come about that my cousin's solicitor wrote to your solicitor, or however it was arranged? Because I didn't ask Mrs. Osgood to seek out a companion from Derbyshire. I didn't give any specific instruction at all. I only said Lady Maud needed someone sensible. The room was very quiet. Meredith said, my cousin arranged this position for me, after my father died. Which cousin? Sylvester Colborne. He inherited my father's estate. He said the position was a good one, and that I would be well placed here. Sylvester Colborne, the Duke repeated. He is a solicitor, Meredith said carefully. He is well connected in certain legal circles. He had access to my father's papers. She paused. He would have known my mother's family name. He would have known the connection. And he sent you here without telling you. Without telling me, she said. Yes. The Duke looked at her for a long moment. Outside, the light had gone to the low gold of late afternoon. A fire had been lit at some point. She hadn't noticed when, and it was warm in the library in a way that felt somehow out of place with the conversation they were having. Why? He said, not angrily, genuinely. What would he gain from sending you here without telling you? I don't know yet, she said. And then, because she had been sitting in this house for over a week, thinking about it. But I think it has something to do with my father's will. Your father didn't leave a will. That's what Sylvester told the court. The Duke looked at her steadily. He was, she realized, a person who arrived at conclusions without requiring a great deal of explanation, which was either a quality of intelligence or a quality of patience or both. Tell me, he said, about your father. She told him. She had not planned to tell him any of it, and then she began and could not stop, which was perhaps what happened when you had been carrying something alone for too long. She told him about her father's last year, the illness that had come on slowly and then fast, the way he had begun putting papers in order and then had seemed to stop, as if he were too tired to finish. She told him about Sylvester arriving 2 days after the death, efficient and sorrowful in equal measure, producing documents and explanations and arrangements. She told him about the court proceedings, quick and clean, in which no one had thought to ask whether there might be a will that had simply not been found. She told him about the bag that wasn't hers, the coat let out at the seams, the carriage that would not wait. She told him about the portrait wrapped in cloth between the stockings. When she finished, the fire had burned lower and the tea was long cold. The Duke said, "What is Sylvester Colborne's connection to this estate?" She had not thought of it in those terms. She sat with it for a moment. "I don't know," she said. "None, that I can see." "You have a claim to this estate," he said. "Not a legal claim as things currently stand. But if your mother was Eleanor Ashfield's daughter, and Eleanor Ashfield was born here, and the rupture in the family was unofficial, personal, not a formal legal disinheritance." He stopped. He was working through it, not presenting a conclusion but following a thought. There are questions about Eleanor's portion. There always are when a family severs ties without going through proper legal process. An estate like this generates paperwork across generations. Solicitors know what's in that paperwork. He paused. A man who understood that there might be a claim and who wanted to ensure it was never made formally might arrange to place the claimant somewhere harmless, somewhere she had no legal standing, somewhere she appeared as a servant, not as family. The room was very quiet. "He sent me here," Meredith said slowly, "so that I would be a companion, so that even if I found out the connection, I would already be established in this house in a role that would make any claim impossible to take seriously. Or," the Duke said, "he didn't think you'd find out at all. He may have thought the connection was buried deeply enough, and that sending you here kept you near enough to manage, and dependent enough to be quiet. He underestimated how quickly I would want to know about the portrait room." "It seems he did," the Duke said. He stood up. He crossed to the fireplace and stood looking at it, and she watched him think. It was an unusual thing, to be in a room with someone and be able to see them actually think, not performing thoughtfulness, but genuinely working something through. She had not known many people like that. Her father had been one. "I want to be clear about something," he said, still looking at the fire. "This estate is mine. That is not a question. I am not suggesting otherwise." He turned around. "But the story of how it came to be mine, and whether certain arrangements made a generation ago were proper, and what your father may or may not have known. Those are questions I want answered, not because I feel you are owed a particular outcome." He paused. "But because a woman was removed from this family, and the removal was never accounted for, and that is the kind of thing that should be accounted for." Meredith said, "What are you proposing?" "I am proposing," he said, "that you stop hiding the fact of who you are, that you tell me properly everything you know, that I write to my own solicitor, who is not Sylvester Colborne, and ask him to look into your father's papers." Another pause. "And that you come to supper tonight at the main table as a guest of this house, and not at the servants' supper, and that we proceed from there." She looked at him for a long moment. "You found me in your library this morning. I found you looking for answers in a house where the answers were hidden," he said. "That's enough to begin with." Lady Maud at supper took one look at Meredith seated across the table and said, "Ah, so you found the portrait room." Meredith set down her fork. "You knew." "I suspected," Lady Maud said placidly. "I knew an Eleanor Ashfield existed. I knew she had descendants somewhere, The cheekbones were rather obvious, dear. I was waiting to see how long it would take you. She reached for her wine. It took you 10 days, which is faster than I expected. The Duke, at the head of the table, said, "You might have mentioned this to me. You might have told me you were having the East Wing properly examined." Lady Maud said, "We all have our secrets." She looked at Meredith. "Your grandmother was a brave woman. Most people would not have married against their family. She had 6 happy years with Robert Colborne before he died of a fever, and she raised your mother alone, and she never once, by all accounts, regretted it." She set down her glass. "I had this from a letter your great-great-aunt wrote, which I found 20 years ago and never showed anyone, because there was no one to show it to. I'll give it to you after supper." Meredith said, "Why didn't you say anything when I arrived?" Lady Maud looked at her. Her eyes were very sharp in her old face, the kind of sharp that doesn't diminish. "Because," she said, "you arrived here presenting yourself as a servant, and I wanted to see what you would do with that. Whether you would stay small and quiet and let it rest, or whether you would look." She picked up her fork. "You looked. That tells me what I needed to know." The supper continued. Outside the windows of Ashfield's dining room, the November dark lay over the grounds, and somewhere under that dark were the gardens and the drive and the long avenue of trees. And 30 miles to the south was the house that had been her father's, that was now Sylvester's, where somewhere in a locked cabinet there was. She believed there was. She had to believe there was a will that had not been produced. "I'll want to speak to your solicitor," she said to the Duke. "I've already written," he said. "He'll be here Thursday." She looked at him across the table. "You did that this afternoon," she said. "I did it before supper," he said. "While you were changing." He said it very simply, the way a person says a thing that seems obvious to them. And she thought about what it meant, that he had walked out of the library, gone upstairs, and without discussion or deliberation had written a letter to his solicitor on her behalf. Not because he knew her, not because he had anything to gain from it, but because he had heard her story and then done the next logical thing. She had not had that in a very long time. Someone simply doing the next logical thing on her behalf. "Thank you," she said. He looked at her. "Don't thank me yet. We don't know what he'll find." "No," she said, "but I will still thank you." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You should have been told who you were before you were sent here. Before any of it, you should have known." Lady Maud, across the table, made a small sound that was not quite words and reached for the bread. Meredith looked at the fire at the far end of the room. She thought of the portrait, her grandmother's portrait, hanging in the room at the end of the East Wing, the woman who had chosen the person she wanted and paid every price for it. She thought of her father, quiet man, private man, who had perhaps not known the half of what he held in trust. She thought of the bag that wasn't hers, and the coat let out at the seams, and the carriage that would not wait. She had come to this house as a servant, with nothing. She was beginning to understand that she had come home.